Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John Dehlin. It's October 9th, 2019, and we are super excited to be back with you for more engaging Mormon Stories Podcast interviews. Today, we are continuing our really fascinating series with Chris Shelton. For those of you who follow us on Facebook Live, you'll know because we released this there originally that we did 3 hours with one of the world's experts in Scientology. Again, his name is Chris Shelton. He's a writer, an author, a blogger. He's a YouTuber, a public speaker. He does a lot of cool stuff, but it's all around Scientology because Chris Shelton himself is not only a former Scientologist, but a former Sea Org member, which is the elite organization within Scientology. So what we did and he has just vast encyclopedic knowledge of the Scientology movement. And so we spent our first 3 hours with Chris digging deep into the life of Scientology founder L. Ron Hubbard, and drawing parallels between, the founder of Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard, and the founder of Mormonism, which is Joseph Smith, and then the founding and the rise of Scientology and the parallels between that and the parallels with Mormonism and the rise of Mormonism. And we found so many interesting parallels from, polygamy and the founding to, financial misappropriations to, moving from city to city to escape the law, to trying to escape the jurisdictions of the United States, to, everything kind of unraveling in chaos. Not to mention the creation of books. There's so many parallels between L. Ron Hubbard and Joseph Smith. And when we left off sort of at the last years of L. Ron Hubbard, as he was either on his boat or in a hideout in California, sort of in this almost Howard Hughes-like final years as a recluse, because it wasn't safe for him to be anywhere in public, or he would have been incarcerated, which again sounds very much like Joseph Smith, other than the fact that Joseph Smith was assassinated and L. Ron Hubbard wasn't, as far as I know or we know. So that's where we left off. Today, we're going to be covering at a minimum the rise of modern Scientology, which includes the takeover of Scientology by David Miscavige, or Miscavige. We'll learn how to pronounce that soon, and we'll bring our historical knowledge of Scientology up to the present, and then whether we'll do this today or next time in a final set of interviews with Chris, we want to hear about Chris's life as a Scientologist, what it's like to be a Scientologist today, what his life was like as a Scientologist, what caused him to leave Scientology, and then what caused him to become an ex-Scientologist activist, and what it's like to be an ex-Scientologist activist in a world where we know Scientology goes after people hard, even litigiously. So that's going to be fascinating. Before we actually jump into our interview with Chris, I just want to announce one super important thing. One is, if you haven't checked out my interview with Wayne Sermon and Alex Sermon, Wayne is the lead guitarist for Imagine Dragons. You really need to check that out. We drove down to Vegas and interviewed Wayne and Alex. And Alex is in her own right a super talented human. She's a prima ballerina, and just a really wise and funny and thoughtful soul. But we talked to them about, their lives in Mormonism, their lives with Imagine Dragons, and then, of course, their journey out of Mormonism. And it's a really profound several-hour interview. I recommend it. But the reason why we're so excited to interview Wayne, other than the great story, is we're holding for the first time ever a really important event on November 17th, 2019. In Salt Lake City, we are going to be holding a day, almost like a conference or a general conference, dedicated to healing, growth, and community for post-Mormons and ex-Mormons. The conference is called Thrive. or Thrive Beyond Mormonism. It's think of, hopefully several thousand of you, progressive, ex-Mormons and progressive Mormons in the same room, hearing great music, hearing great speakers, inspiring one another, meeting leaders in the community, and getting to know each other so that we can figure out what comes after Orthodox Mormonism in our culture. It's really important. There are a lot of marriages struggling, a lot of people struggling, and there's a lot of need. We don't want to recreate a church. We don't want to recreate a patriarchy, but we do want to nurture healthy community, a vibrant community, and basically friendships and support for people who are struggling, and resources, or for people who are just lonely and need support. Because there are tens of thousands of people out there that have never heard of Mormon Stories, never heard of CES Letter, never heard of any of this stuff. And they're totally alone, thinking they're the only ones in the world going through a faith crisis. And you'd think that by now everyone would know about us, but the truth is we've only scratched the surface, and I'm not exaggerating. So we're going to do Thrive Day, November 17th. We're bringing Wayne Sermon of Imagine Dragons to speak as a keynote speaker. We're bringing Amber Scora of the book Leaving the Witness to Salt Lake City. She's going to give a keynote, and then we're going to have a bunch of amazing speakers: Natasha Alpha Parker, Christian Moore, Stephanie Sorensen Larson of Encircle. The list is super long, and great people, great speakers, Donna Showalter, and so many others. So we want you to attend. So if you're interested, we've priced it super cheap. It's $15 a person. We're going to lose money on this event. It's almost guaranteed, because it's at the Salt Palace. And once you get AV and a room reserved, you're 20 grand into this event. So, to break even, we're going to have to get like 4,000 people there. That'll be great if we can, but we're planning on losing money. So this is not a money-making enterprise. Nobody's making money. Not that it's bad for people adding value to be compensated for their efforts, but at least in these ground stages, we don't want people to think that this is about profiteering off of anyone's pain. And so we're offering this at pretty much no cost to you. $15 for a full day of awesomeness is super cheap. So come if you can. Go to thrivebeyondmormonism.com for more information. You can register there. Please tell your friends. And we would just love to see you all there. And thanks for your patience. And please spread the word. If we can get, several thousand people there and get some news media coverage, it can be a really important event to promote healing and growth. And we'll be sharing all the content eventually on the internet as well. So that's my plug. Now back to you, Chris Shelton. Welcome back to Mormon Stories Podcast. It's such an honor to have you back.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here for sure. And very impressive work you're doing. I mean, this whole Thrive conference sounds awesome. I'm just thinking we should do something like that in the Scientology world. It's very necessary for healing and growth that people be able to reconnect up after coming out of these things and find out there is life beyond this stuff.
Well, thank you. Just really quickly while we're on that, like, I started out just as, a Mormon going through a faith crisis. Then I realized there were all these people who needed help. So then I went back and got my PhD in psychology so that I could help people. And then people started just coming to me with marriage problems and depression and anxiety and all these sorts of problems. And we just realized really quickly that we could have all the therapists in the world specializing in faith crisis stuff, all the podcasts in the world, but people need friendships, they need community, they need support, and frankly, they need resources. They need to learn about healthy marriages. They need to learn about how to communicate with believing family and friends so they don't wreck relationships. They need to learn how to raise healthy, happy children outside of Mormonism, how to handle drugs and alcohol. Like, there's all this stuff that, how to drink coffee. Like, there are all these really basic life skills that humans in the developed world learn. That Mormons never learn, and I'm sure it's the same with Jehovah's Witnesses and Scientologists and evangelical Christians and Orthodox Jews. And so thanks for that validation, and we're just really excited, and we're really looking forward to partnering. That's why we've had Tova Mirvasan, Tara Westover. That's why we're having you on, Amber Scora, because we do think a lot of the stuff we're experimenting with and exploring in Mormonism can actually be useful across the aisle. So we're looking for partners. So Chris Shelton, we're really glad you're willing to collaborate. And I know you've collaborated with Jonathan Streeter, whom we love, and maybe some other ex-Mormons as well?
Ex-Mormons, no. It's been you and Jonathan Streeter so far, and I am looking forward to doing more collaborations on this.
That's great. Oh, and of course, a really important collaboration is Stephen Hassan, who is obviously one of the world's experts in cults. We've really enjoyed our friendship with him, and we hope after he gets done selling his book that we can collaborate with him as well. But
exactly.
All right, Chris. Well, let's jump into it. For those of you who didn't listen to the first 3 hours, stop, go back and listen to the first 3 hours with Chris Shelton, because you need those first 3 hours to understand the rise of Scientology, the rise of L. Ron Hubbard, his life as, a pulp fiction, science fiction writer, his life in the military, his ascent as a public figure, as he develops an approach to mental health called Dianetics that became a real big thing before it imploded. And that was when he realized that he could make a lot more money starting a religion than he could, starting a business or as an author. And that's where things went bananas. And the parallels, everyone who listened to that episode, Chris, I know I was stopping you like every 10 minutes and saying, wait a minute.
Which was great. I loved it.
So many people are like, I mean, every time there was this huge parallel, it was just like, wait a minute, that happened with Joseph Smith. And sure enough, the listeners that did tune in on Facebook Live were just stunned by the parallels. And by the way, as I've listened to the life of David Miscavige, I heard a lot of parallels to Brigham Young, who was Joseph Smith's successor. So I'm going to be fascinated to hear how much of the parallels with David Miscavige tie to Joseph Smith versus Brigham Young versus not being a tie. But that's what we're going to do. Last we talked, Chris, we had L. Ron Hubbard living in some secret hideaway, either on a boat or in some hideaway in California, with only a couple of people knowing where he was. And he was still active. He was still writing books. He was still trying to do stuff. But he kind of dies in isolation. And I think that's where we left it. Now tell me if there's anything we needed to go back and sort of mention, and then let's talk about the succession of
let's do it. Okay, so we are going to go back in time a little bit, a few years. L. Ron Hubbard died January 24th, I believe, 1986. And we kind of took it up to that from the viewpoint of what was Hubbard doing. And now let's talk about David Miscavige. And it is Miscavige, by the way, but it's not uncommon. You're not the only person who's ever mispronounced it as Miscavige.
So it's Miscavige. Okay.
Yeah, it's Miscavige. And so he's a very interesting, controversial figure himself. And his rise to power in Scientology was not a very pleasant experience for a whole lot of people. It wasn't, they position him now as the hand-picked successor from L. Ron Hubbard, and nothing, of course, could be further from the truth.
Okay, yeah. And that, when we talk about Joseph Smith, there were like 8 successors that he personally had told they would succeed him because he wanted them all to be loyal to him. And so it was like his son, Brigham Young, Sidney Rigdon, all these different successors. And so it was a big cluster F for a couple of years while different people were vying for power. And ultimately Brigham Young won the mainstream group of Mormon followers, but there were lots of schisms. So I'm dying to hear.
Yeah.
Did L. Ron Hubbard envision a successor?
Well, not exactly, and it's kind of interesting because there's no written document anywhere that says David Miscavige is my successor. There is a will, but even that's in question as to whether Hubbard actually wrote the will that was the final will that was acted on. But that will did not include anything about church, secession, or succession rather. So it was kind of a messy picture, and there was a lot of shenanigans and a lot of moving parts to it, of course, because, it's complicated. So I'm going to try to simplify it for outsiders, for people who are not going to be familiar with all the structures and trappings of Scientology, and try to explain this in a sensible way. But there are some details that we have to get into. So I thought what we would do is maybe go back to 1979, because that's really when David Miscavige kind of comes on the scene in any kind of significant way. And over the years between 1979 and 1986, when Hubbard finally passed away, Miscavige had finally gotten to a place where he could take over. And by the end of 1986, 87, he had definitely solidified his position. So I thought maybe we'd walk through those years in some detail, and then I could lay out what Scientology has done under Miscavige's leadership and how it has run to where it is now.
Perfect.
Okay, so let's set the scene here. Even if you didn't see what was happening before in our last episode, in our first interview, 1979 finds a couple things going on. In 1977, the FBI had raided Big Blue, the Cedars-Sinai complex of Scientology, which at the time had all kinds of operational intelligence information and stuff, because the church had its own intelligence wing, which at that time was called the Guardian's Office. And they had been engaged in covert operations against the United States government in an effort to cleanse the files of the government, not just the United States government. This was also happening in other places, but most spectacularly, they got busted in the United States because they were trying to sneak into these buildings, make copies of all the files, remove files, take out documents, and basically scrub the government files, which is kind of the mind of those organizations, of anything that was bad or critical of Scientology and L. Ron Hubbard. And this was called the Snow White program, to make L. Ron Hubbard's name, pure as Snow White. So they had gotten busted. The FBI had gotten wind of this. There had been a guy who'd gotten caught being somewhere he wasn't supposed to be, at the IRS headquarters, I think, in D.C., in the library there. And that led to one thing, led to another, and this whole bust happens. So Scientology is getting its name smeared properly and correctly in the headlines for criminal activities. And there were 11 Scientologists who were indicted for conspiracy, fraud, various things. There was a whole laundry list of charges. And Mary Sue Hubbard, L. Ron Hubbard's wife, was one of those 11. So this was a huge deal. This was not a small thing. And it wasn't just some little local thing. It was naming L. Ron Hubbard himself as an unindicted co-conspirator. So now let's go to 1979, when, this is still in tumultuous investigation and things are going on, and Scientology's quote unquote good name is not really so good anymore. And we find L. Ron Hubbard in a place called La Quinta, or La Quinta. I'm not really sure exactly what the right pronunciation is there, but it's a place in California near Palm Desert, and it's kind of situated between the San Bernardino National Forest and Joshua Tree. It's kind of about 2 hours. If you drove from Long Beach straight east, you'd end up around La Quinta, and that's where Hubbard was hiding out. He was off the radar. He did not want to be found. He did not want to have to answer for any of this, and he was an unindicted co-conspirator. So he wasn't gonna be charged, but there was, like, if somebody would have flipped on him, he very easily could have been charged, because he clearly was the mastermind of the entire Snow White operation. Okay, so he's running Scientology behind the scenes, and he's also out there in the desert with the Sea Org members, these people who are utterly devoted to him and are working 24/7 for the cause of Scientology. That's what the Sea Org is. It's the core, clergy or ecclesiastical center of the Church of Scientology. And they're working with him, and he's out there trying to continue to advance Scientology's purposes and plans. He's not just, crying about the legal case. So he's out there making films, actually making training films for Scientology counselors. And
Hey, Chris,
April,
does it make sense to go back and have we talked about David Miscavige's sort of upbringing and just a quick bio of how he ascended to where he did?
Yes, I will mention that quickly.
Okay.
So let's see. So now by this time, by 79, David Miscavige is 19 years old. He was born in 1960.
Okay.
He was born to Ron Miscavige Sr. He had a brother, Ronnie Miscavige Jr., and he's got a sister, Denise, and I think there might be one other relative in there. I can't remember. And his father is an ex-military guy. He's an ex-Marine. He's a sales guy. And sometime in the early 1970s, if I remember the dates right, Ron Miscavige Sr. got involved with Scientology in Philadelphia, he was from Philadelphia. That was where David Miscavige was born. I think they were still in that area, but they might have traveled around. But the important points here are that in the early 1970s, Ron Miscavige gets involved in Scientology, starts doing classes. His son, David, has asthma, has an asthmatic condition. He's kind of a wild child, not particularly, evil or horrible or there's no evidence of him, cutting up animals or any kind of goofy craziness like that. He had pretty regular middle-class upbringing under a father who was pretty stressed. I mean, he has admitted to physical abuse of his kids and during times of stress and whatever. And so it wasn't a great, it could have been a better upbringing. But there wasn't particularly any indication from the data that we have that David Miscavige as a child or as a young adult was like he is now, so to speak. Okay. So,
okay.
But he gets involved in Scientology himself as a teenager, kind of around the same age as I did, if I remember right. And he got some auditing for this asthma condition. He had really bad asthma, and it would really put him down. And the auditing apparently helped with that. Given the fact that, and I just covered this in a video I did last week, given the fact that asthmatic conditions often have psychosomatic elements to them, it is not unheard of or improbable that some counseling could have relieved some of that asthma, which is not the same thing as saying that it cured it, because it didn't. And I believe he still has, and certainly carried over with some of the asthma over the years, but Scientology apparently relieved it enough that Miscavige, young David Miscavige was sold that this was the bomb diggity, and he wanted to do more of it. And he started doing more classes, getting more involved. And eventually, I think by the time he was 16 or 17, maybe earlier, but certainly by then, he was saying, hey, I want to go join the Sea organization and work with L. Ron Hubbard, and I want to go do that. And his father let him because he was, sold on Scientology himself. So David Miscavige goes off to go do this. And there's lots of details and stuff I'm kind of glossing over here. But basically, he ended up in the Sea Org, and he ended up rising up to get to where L. Ron Hubbard was located. The Sea Org was a smaller outfit then than it is now, and it was, easier to rise, I guess, to that level at that time than it would be, say, now. And he got up to working in that film unit. He was a cameraman, working directly under L. Ron Hubbard. And there's various stories, which I won't repeat because I really don't know if they're true or not. There were stories told, rumors circulated around when I got into the Sea Org in the 90s. By that time, there were these, legendary stories or anecdotes about how Miscavige had interacted with Hubbard and shown himself to be this very loyal and on policy, meaning he followed Hubbard's directions very well. And even if he had to disagree with Hubbard on it, and stuff like this. So there were these stories that would circulate around about what a great guy he was. So then by 1979, by the time all this tumultuous activity is going on and Hubbard's, hiding out in the desert, Miscavige is a cameraman. He then gets himself into a situation where he's promoted to a post called the Action Chief. And I guess the simplest way to explain that is that one of the ways that the Sea organization at a core upper management level would enforce its will, or L. Ron Hubbard's will, on the lower church organizations that are not Sea Org, that are not manned by Sea Org members, that are just regular people or regular Scientologists doing the work, The Sea Org would send projects, or what they called missions, and they would send 2 people or sometimes more, never less than 2. And those projects or missions would operate on very specific directions. You're to get, target 1, target 2, target 3, target 4 done, and then come back. That was the project, or that was the mission. And somebody at the headquarters level would run the project people, would tell them what to do, right? Would receive daily reports from them and then give them direction on what to do. That position was called the action chief. And this was the guy who was overall responsible for these projects that were being sent out. But from the level of management where L. Ron Hubbard was the one ordering these missions to get done, or very, very senior Scientologists were, he was right up there in that, at that, breathing the rarefied air of where L. Ron Hubbard was. So that was a position of some responsibility and some importance, right? And it's given to this 19-year-old Sea Org member who's really gung-ho and really, looks like he's with the program. So that's kind of where David Miscavige fits at this time. And we'll trace how he rises from there. Okay, now Hubbard at this time had been the guy who had been heading up Scientology management and heading up the Sea Org for all these years. There had been an effort, you might remember in our last talk, for Hubbard to kind of cut those ties when he started up the Sea Org, and he thought he was just going to go off and do the Sea Org thing, and management was just going to kind of happen with the people he turned it over to. But Hubbard was such a kind of megalomaniac control guy that he had to have his hands in everything. And within 2 years, he had disestablished all of that worldwide management stuff and taken it back over. So the Sea Org is running Scientology internationally. And of course, L. Ron Hubbard is the head of the Sea Org. But he could not be seen at this point to be the guy giving all the orders, because they needed plausible deniability so that he would not go from unindicted co-conspirator to indicted conspirator, right, on this federal charge. And there were other tax evasion was going on at this time. The church hadn't paid their taxes in a decade. So there were a lot of reasons L. Ron Hubbard had to fear the law. So they set up this other management structure, and I won't get into all the details of it. We don't have to go into all that kind of nitty gritty, but I will say that they formed a committee which was called the Watchdog Committee. And this was the most trusted high-level Sea Org members under L. Ron Hubbard. A woman named Dee Dee Riesdorf and Gail Irwin were the chairperson and the deputy chairperson. And these were people who had worked directly under Hubbard for years, were very, very trusted, as well as a couple named Pat and Annie Broker, whose names you'll hear more of, because they were the ones who ended up being with Hubbard till the very end. So they were part of this Watchdog Committee setup. And this was it was publicly announced in 1979 that this body was the management, the senior ecclesiastical management body for the church. And Mary Sue Hubbard, at this point, just to further set the stage a little bit here, she's living in Florida at this point. She's not in prison yet. In 1979, the case had not gotten to the point where they were going to jail yet. It was all still in the midst of everything. So, but she's out of contact with Hubbard. There can't be any contact between them, again, because of the legal situation. And to add further misery to the Scientology picture, in August of 1979, they had a major legal case turn against them. A woman named Julie Christopherson was suing the church in Portland, Oregon, for fraud and promises that they had made to her in regards to courses that she was going to take in Scientology. She was just a public level Scientologist. She was never a staff or Sea Org member. Well, the church lost the suit, and they had to pay $153,000 in compensatory damages and an additional $1.9 million in punitive damages. And this is 1979 money. So this was going to completely destroy the church if they ended up having to pay that. So just a little bit of pressure on the church, right? No big deal.
And this reminds me of the type of pressure the Mormon church got when the government started coming after it for practicing polygamy. By 1890, the church was going to go bankrupt, was going to be, all of its assets were going to be seized. It faced a true existential crisis. And that was basically because of Joseph's polygamy starting in the early 1840s, that then followed on by Brigham Young and everybody else. And
yeah,
it's one of those existential moments where the church is almost bankrupt and is almost destroyed.
That's right. And that was the situation with the Church of Scientology here at this time. That is not overstating the case. And it actually was kind of in this stress mode for quite a while. This was one of the reasons, this was one of the ways that Miscavige was able to use this to get rid of people and rise up, as we'll see. So in October of 1979, 9 of the people who were indicted by the FBI agreed to be found guilty on charges of conspiracy and theft. They reduced the charges but pled guilty. And this Operation Snow White thing had been going on it was a 4-year program. It was a very long, extended operation. And it's been characterized as the largest known infiltration of the United States government that has ever been carried out by anyone. So it was not a small thing they did. They tried to spin it as they were being prosecuted for religious purposes, and all they did was steal copy paper, and it was all much ado about nothing. But this was not nothing. This was a very big deal. So these guys get indicted, and in December, 5 high-ranking members of the church, and this includes Hubbard's wife, are sentenced to prison for conspiring to obstruct justice and to obstruct a criminal investigation. And they are basically sentenced to 4 years. Mary Sue, I think, was sentenced to 5. And I believe she served 2 or 3 of those years. But that happens at the end of 1979. So in 1980, Hubbard takes off. Like at this point, he had been in a place in La Quinta and then in Hemet, California, where a small number of Sea Org members, but more than 2, the management people still could contact him, were still around him. But by March of 1980, he's out of there. He gets in a Bluebird motorhome with Pat and Annie Broker, are his 2 trusted people. And this is the last time, March of 1980, that he was publicly seen by anyone admitting to having seen him until his death in January 1986. So this is the point when he truly disappears and goes completely off grid.
Okay.
By October, he's written Battlefield Earth. That manuscript comes out. Remember that turkey?
Right, John Travolta movie.
That's right. One of the worst movies ever made. I did a whole review on it. It's just awful. I got stories about that we can get into when we do my story. And then he also wrote, and this is just kind of the height of irony, and I thought you'd appreciate this, is he also writes a pamphlet called The Way to Happiness. And this is presented to the world as a secular moral code based solely on common sense. So this guy is literally in hiding from federal authorities. He's evading taxes. He's running this abusive church secretly. And he writes this moral code for the world to live a more moral life. And to this day, the irony of that just I can't get past that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is a thing. This Way to Happiness is a big thing in the world of Scientology now. They've used this thing. They print it. They sell it. They get it out to people. They promote it like crazy.
What are some of the highlights or the main points?
Oh, don't kill people. Don't be a thief. Be temperate. I mean, they are common sense principles. There's nothing inherently wrong.
It's the type of stuff Dr. Phil or Oprah or Brene Brown would say.
Yeah, right? Oprah would embrace it. She would love The Way to Happiness.
Okay. All right.
Okay. So then we come into so as you can imagine, things were a little bit chaotic at the upper levels of Scientology, and they're trying to get the legal stuff under control. They're trying to run the churches. They've got a price increase going on their services because inflation is a thing. This is during the time of the oil crisis. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff going on at this time. So we come into 1981, and there is a new project set up. Now, remember, Miscavige had been the guy who was running all the projects and missions from this post called Action Chief. So he is now given charge of something called Mission All Clear. Okay, Mission All Clear. And this starts in January 1981. And Miscavige, there are 34 liability court cases against the church, and many of them are naming L. Ron Hubbard as a defendant. And remember, they just got their ass handed to them in Oregon, and they're appealing that case because if they pay that money, they're done. So there's no way they can let that court case stand. They cannot let that verdict stand. They have to appeal out of it somehow, or somehow get out of that. And there's 34 more cases lined up. And L. Ron Hubbard being named as a defendant means he's going to have to show up for those. He's going to have to get deposed, etc. So they are like, this is a big, huge problem that is now right in David Miscavige's lap. And they decide that they're going to clear all this up. And this project is top priority. There's nothing else that takes precedence over this Mission All Clear, to clear up all the legal threats and liabilities and get them all dealt with and get them off the lines. And so they set up an All Clear Committee. And this is David Miscavige is on this. That Dee Dee and Lois Reisdorf are on there. Gail Irwin is on there. Norman Starkey, Terry Gamboa. These are names that were, very, very important at senior Scientology level at this point. These are all trusted people who have worked directly with Hubbard for years. Now he's off. They don't know where he is. None of these people know his physical location. And that, of course, was done to protect him. Then the project is so confidential that Miscavige sets up a direct and personal line of communication with Pat Broker. Pat Broker is the one Pat and Annie are the ones who are taking care of Hubbard. Now, David Miscavige does not get told by Pat Broker over this time where Hubbard is, but Hubbard still has charge of everything. They're just all pretending he doesn't to the public. He's still calling the shots. So they have to get communication back and forth from the church to Hubbard. And Miscavige and Broker are the conduits for that communication line. And if you think about that for a second, you realize just how much power that gives to David Miscavige and Pat Broker. Because right. Hubbard, they're the middlemen. Everything Hubbard sees has gone through their hands first.
They can filter things from him seeing them, and they can filter things that he says.
Correct.
They can filter who gets to him and who doesn't.
That's right. And this secret, this line that is set up is done by Miscavige in such a way as to make it appear, from what I'm told, this is just off my recall of what I was told. It doesn't necessarily, I can't say 1,000% that this is true. But the way Miscavige got himself into this position was to make it appear that by doing this, he would be helping and relieving the people who were nominally actually in charge of management and this whole operation, right? Miscavige is still this guy who's in charge of this project that does not put him in charge of the Church of Scientology at all. He's just in charge of this project. But with all the high names and everybody who's involved with this, and they having to work on the day-to-day operations of the church, they were happy to let Miscavige deal with the communication line. So he made it look like it was a feature, not a bug. It was a service for him to do this, right? And that's why they let him do it. Because people might go, well, why would they let this lower terminal, this lower person, do that? And well, that's why. So there's some other management reorganization, but get this: by June of '81, right? So this all starts in January. By June, Dee Dee Vogading was busted off of her post by Miscavige, basically, and replaced by her sister and her deputy, Gail Irwin. So those names the names themselves are not super important. The fact is that within 6 months, Miscavige is starting to maneuver getting people removed secretly from posts. They don't necessarily know he's the one doing this right away.
So it's kind of purging.
Yeah. And that's where it starts.
And he's kind of making sure his loyalists are there, and anyone that could be a threat is kind of neutralized, right?
So by May, Mary Sue is not yet in prison yet. She's still, kind of around. She's writing to Hubbard. She's writing to, she's trying to be relevant, trying to be part of this stuff. And she actually holds legally, from a legal or structural standpoint, Mary Sue was still called the controller. That was her job position. And she held control over the corporate structure of Scientology and the trademarks. So she was still this huge legal liability for the church. And she's got all this power, at least as far as the paperwork goes. They're not letting her exert any of this power, but it's still there and it's still a problem. And so by June, they decide that Mary Sue, and Mary Sue, from that position as the controller, by the way, was the person who was in charge of the Guardian's office, that whole internal covert operations division I mentioned earlier. Mary Sue was the one who headed that whole thing up. So she's over this Guardian's office, and Miscavige and Broker and these guys decide, okay, that all has to go, because look what they did and look how screwed up everything is now. It's all on them. So he personally confronts Mary Sue and persuades her to step down as the controller, legally signs the documents that I'm not this anymore. I'm not in charge of anything anymore. And Miscavige basically browbeat her into that. Later on, he bragged about, how he took her out, right? And what a bitch she was. And they send 20 missionaires, 20 of these people on these special projects, down to St. Hill and to Los Angeles. So they send them to England and they send them to Los Angeles, and they just disband the Guardian's office. It's just over. It's done. And they even send the woman in England, Jane Kember, actually resisted. She was like, this isn't valid. This isn't real. I don't believe it. I want to hear from Mary Sue. And they actually concocted a fake telex and sent it to her to convince her that this was Hubbard's desires. And they just basically took apart this whole Guardian's office. Now, don't get me wrong here. Of course, this Guardian's office was horrible and it needed to be disbanded. But this was all cover your ass, damage control. And it was getting Mary Sue Hubbard, who arguably was the only person who could influence L. Ron Hubbard directly, personally, right? They'd been keeping her out of touch with Hubbard. Now they got her defanged, declawed, dethroned, everything. So she was just not in a power position anymore with the Church of Scientology.
And I have to, so here's another parallel. So Brigham Young, the successor of Joseph Smith, his animosity towards Emma Smith, Joseph Smith's wife, is famous. He called her something the equivalent of a spawn of Satan, and did everything, for 150 years in Mormonism, or at least as I knew it, Emma Smith's name was known for evil in the church. And it wasn't until just the past 10, 20 years where the church has allowed her to be kind of resurrected as actually a good person. Because as the history comes out that shows all that she dealt with and how much she hated polygamy and how she allowed Joseph Smith to practice polygamy, but hated it, but fought him against it, but ultimately said it was okay. But then once he died, she denied it. It put her at odds with Brigham Young, who of course wanted to seize power. And by the way, Emma wanted her son, Joseph Smith Jr., or the third, to succeed Joseph Smith. And so for all those reasons, Emma stayed behind in Illinois while Brigham took the bulk of the saints to Salt Lake, and they hated on Emma for 150 years. So
wow. Well,
does that sound familiar? You got to socially kill the wife of the founder if you want to succeed the founder, basically.
Yeah, and in this case, they basically defanged and declawed Mary Sue, and then they just kind of put her in a home, and literally a house in not too far away, actually, from where Big Blue is, if I remember right, in that area. And she just lived out the rest of her years with a little dog, and she kind of stayed quiet and cooperated because she had been broken.
Right.
They did not broadly tarnish her name. They simply removed her and never spoke about her again and started removing references to her. You hardly hear anything about Mary Sue in Scientology now.
But as I understand it, she was a critical part. As I heard you tell the story in the first 3 hours, L. Ron Hubbard was not a manager, and her management prowess was an integral part of the rise of Scientology.
Without question, that is true.
Okay.
And Hubbard would, and I know this not only because of my own conjecture, but because Hubbard literally would talk about her in his lectures. And he would talk about what a great job she had done organizing this area or dealing with this, and how she could come in and she could just whip everybody into shape and get everybody in production and go, let's go. And Hubbard and her would travel around to the different organizations through the 1950s and 60s. And they would do this kind of thing. And Hubbard bragged about how good she was at that. So it's not just, I'm not just pulling that out of nowhere. And so she was absolutely crucial. And then he made her the one in charge of his entire covert operations wing. And she ran that thing like its own, like she was the general over that. And then, of course, they get busted, this whole fiasco happens, and she gets summarily dismissed and removed and is no longer to be spoken about. So that was Mary Sue's fate. And when they took apart the Guardian's office, the really horrible thing about it was, had they disbanded it and just left it disbanded and never spoke about it or talked about it ever again, Scientology would be a completely different animal right now. But instead, what they did is they remade it into what is now called the Office of Special Affairs, that does all the same things, operates on all the same guidelines and policies that Hubbard and Mary Sue used to run the GO. Now that is all turned over to the Office of Special Affairs. And that is now the church's covert and overt intelligence branch. And they've been running since this time. So it wasn't like they made a big show out of cleaning house. Then they could point to that. And for years they did. They said, we got rid of all the bad guys. We got rid of all the bad elements. They're all gone now. There's no more Guardian's office. We're good people now. We learned our lesson. But behind the scenes, all they'd really done is rebranded the Guardian's office as Office of Special Affairs. And they turned it into a Sea Org operation, whereas when it was under Mary Sue, it had not been a Sea Org operation.
So normally, cults need a leader. They need a head. And,
yes.
And there needs to be consensus around the successor. And usually there's sort of power struggles, not a clear path to succession. And then someone emerges. What was the process of was there a formal or an informal process of the members, maybe from an internal PR perspective, coming to embrace David Miscavige as the successor?
Well, I will get to that.
Okay. Sorry.
And this everything I'm talking about so far is really just the beginning.
We're building to that.
Process.
Okay. We're building to that.
Yeah, we are definitely building to that.
All right.
Taking out Mary Sue was a huge feather in Miscavige's cap as far as he was concerned, because she had brought all this, horrible awfulness on the church.
Right.
And you can see how taking out the founder's wife at this point in time was considered a good thing. Everybody else kind of thought, well, maybe she didn't deserve to get, browbeaten, but look at what she did. It was all on her. They were happy to think that L. Ron Hubbard might not have had anything to do with the whole Snow White fiasco. And Scientologists are now going to jail. I mean, this is really serious. So him taking her out was, yay, go, good that Miscavige took it upon himself to go do that, right?
Right.
He then gets into the purging, even because it starts with Mary Sue, but then there's more. By August, he had written up what was called an internal justice action. Let's call it that, right? The Scientology has its own internal justice system. I think all of us who come out of these cults know that they have their own little law and order set up, and they play by their own rules. And
in Mormonism, it's called the Strengthening the Members Committee. That's what it's called in Mormonism.
Yes. In Scientology, you can have what's called a committee of evidence, which is an ad hoc committee put together for a specific purpose to look into a specific instance of injustice or criminal activity or something like that. And it's 3 to 5 Scientologists who will listen to, call witnesses, look at all the evidence, and then make a determination of what discipline, if any, is required. That's basically, in a nutshell, what a ComEv or a committee of evidence is. He held a committee of evidence in August '81 on a whole bunch of people, just a who's who of high-level people in Scientology, and they were all found guilty, removed from post, stripped of rank, but the findings of that committee were never published. See, a lot of this stuff was done sort of up there. The public Scientologists were not aware of this stuff going on. They did not know Mary Sue had gotten busted. They did not know about Miscavige doing all this stuff. He was not yet in the public eye. So there's not full disclosure going on. What I'm telling you about right now is stuff that was going on at the international base or in Hubbard's inner circle, but this was not known to all the Scientologists at large. They were being told, everything's fine. Scientology's never been in a better place. We're defeating the horrible, awful government that's trying to suppress us. We're defeating the legal suppressives who are trying to destroy the church through legal chicanery and lies and nonsense. This is what the church members are being told. But up top, Miscavige is purging people. Like, he's just not wasting any time getting rid of people that he thinks are going to be a problem to him. And in fact, in 26 August of 1981, there's an issue called Management Changes that gets sent out, which gives data on how the Guardian's office had gone criminal and how LRH wasn't responsible, and they've cleaned it all up, et cetera, et cetera. So then they start forming up. They do this other special project, which is called Project X, or the Special Project. And these two projects are now running concurrently with Miscavige over both of them, or involved with both of them. And they start reforming the corporate structure of Scientology itself. It had been in one corporate structure system, and they started changing all of that. And they brought in tax attorneys and lawyers and professionals, as well as Scientology attorneys and accountants, and they formed up a new corporate structure for Scientology. And I really don't need to get into all the details of it. It's not important for what we're talking about now, except that you need to know that the reasons for the corporate structure were to create a labyrinth of corporate entities that would make up the Church of Scientology as a whole, and to do it in such a way that no one could ever take out Scientology. You could take out one part of it, but then the Hydra head, right? There'd be another thing, and then there'd be another thing, and there'd be another thing. So no matter how the church was attacked legally, it could not be dissolved through 1 or 2 court cases or something like that. The other thing that this labyrinthian structure did was it protected Hubbard as an individual from any liability or problems with any of this. It also happened to later protect Miscavige, because whoever is leading Scientology, that's who it protects. And it was a way to funnel money around, because there were nonprofit and for-profit, and they were figuring that stuff out, and it was all very, very involved. People have tried for years to take all this stuff apart and figure out how to take down Scientology by taking all this stuff apart. But the whole reason all of this was put together in the first place was to make it so that you can't do that. And they actually did a pretty good job. So structurally, corporate-wise, Scientology solidified itself into a structure that made it pretty difficult to get into or to attack. And courts, people don't necessarily recognize this, but courts are not like active investigators. When you take a case to court, you try to pierce the corporate veil of Scientology, and it is a gargantuan task. It is very, very difficult to do. So this did protect the church for many, many decades, and still does to a great degree.
And
this all
Mormonism,
goes down.
the legal name of the Mormon Church is the Corporation of the President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Really?
And there are all these probably labyrinthy legal entities like Ensign Peak, which is an investment arm, and I wouldn't even begin to understand the legal structure of the Mormon Church, other than to say, my guess is that our church has gone through a similar reconstruction legally in a way that would protect it against any governmental threats. And I would call on any listeners who are real lawyers who understand corporate entities to do a quick comparison of the legal entities of Scientology versus Mormonism to see how much there are parallels. But my guess is that they're using the same lawyers potentially.
Yeah, maybe so. So by October 1981, so all of this is happening. Everything I'm talking about so far has been pretty much 1981. By October, they have formed an organization called Author Services, Inc. And this organization becomes L. Ron Hubbard's personal literary business affairs organization. That's what it exists for. So, for example, L. Ron Hubbard is an author. He wrote all these books. When those books are sold, L. Ron Hubbard is collecting royalties on those books. That is one of the main income sources for Hubbard, right? In addition to percentages that are paid by the churches to management, some of which would be flowing to Hubbard. So we're talking about a lot of money. And ASI was formed up to manage all of Hubbard's personal and literary and business affairs. And guess who becomes chairman of the board of ASI? David Miscavige.
And this is reminding me of the Jehovah's Witness sort of a transition, because as they started losing their founders, there was some power grab at some point where whoever kind of owned the publications ended up owning the church.
Right, because there's money from that, and of course, if you literally control the scriptures of the church, I mean, that's what we're talking about here.
The intellectual property, right? The sacred texts, the intellectual property, right?
You got it. Exactly. Yeah. So ASI, and there's another organization formed up, which we will hear much more about later, which is called the Religious Technology Center, RTC. So ASI, RTC, and RTC is formed up to hold the trademarks and copyrights and protect them of Dianetics and Scientology, because Hubbard trademarked and service marked all of his stuff. Scientology is not this open religion that you can just use all the terminology and stuff. They copyrighted it all. And RTC holds those trademarks and licenses their use to churches of Scientology. And this was supposed to set up a system where no one would be able to take Scientology out of the church and go deliver it independently of the Church of Scientology. And for many, many years, Scientology exerted its legal wing to take out any challengers, anybody who was using their trademarks or service marks. They really don't go after them so hard now, but there are many, many other reasons for that. At this time in the 80s, they were all about protecting their trademarks and service marks, and RTC's job basically was to police that. So Miscavige then is basically running, by this point now, Miscavige is kind of running Scientology through ASI, because this is the money base, and there's a lot of power in that. And he's appointing different people as president and executive director and corporate affairs director and this kind of thing. So he's got people under him still. And these are the people who are now kind of following his orders and directions. Of the names I'm looking at here, only one of them is still around in Scientology at all. Most of these guys have been gotten rid of one way or another. Okay, so and then money's being funneled, from the church to ASI, and this one guy named Lyman, he was an accountant, lawyer guy. His job was to make it legal. Right? They're getting all this money, and it's just, okay, well, you just figure out how to make it so that the IRS doesn't have a problem with it and all of this. Now, at the same time, there was a big internal shakeup within Scientology, within the world of Scientology, as if it didn't have enough shakeups going on already. By the end of 1981, there were a group of people who were called, they were mission holders. They were people who had been granted the right to deliver Dianetics and Scientology at a very low level, like down, like there were the churches of Scientology, and then there's these things called missions. And this is not connected to the projects and missions thing I mentioned earlier. This is a different thing. Originally, they were called franchises, like McDonald's, like literally like that. You'd get the okay to use the trademarks and the service marks, but you ran it. You were the one who owned it and were in charge of it. And same like how McDonald's runs now, right? These missions were being run by these mission holders, and they were very, very successful. In the 1970s, Scientology did not have the name that it has now at the public level. You had this big court case, and that was a big PR nightmare. But in terms of delivering Scientology and promoting Scientology and making new Scientologists, all through the 60s and definitely into the 70s, Scientology was experiencing a bit of a boom period because of these missions, not because of the Scientology churches or organizations. The churches and the organizations were being run by the Sea Org, and they were being run very incompetently, and it was just awful. And it was all about the money and stuff. But these missions were being run, and they were actually delivering the goods, and they were making a lot of money. And these mission holders, as a result, were becoming quite rich. And Hubbard thought, well, that's bullshit. That's my money. And
right.
So, again, remember that Miscavige and Broker are the ones who are running the communication to Hubbard as well. So Hubbard's already mentally kind of, not in a good place. He's already losing it. He's had strokes. He's had problems. He's really physically losing it. And now he's getting reports about these mission holders making hand over fist money with what he thinks is his stuff. And he doesn't like that, even though he's the one who set that system up. Now he's jealous of these people. And of course, Broker and Miscavige probably, this is conjecture, but they probably stoked the flames of Hubbard's rage about that. And so Hubbard orders that these mission holders are to, pay up and demands fealty and loyalty and all of that, the stuff we usually see out of, narcissists. So there's a big internal shakeup, and a lot of these mission holders get called in at these conferences, and Miscavige and other senior Sea Organization executives show up and read them the riot act, put them on an e-meter, start interrogating them about their crimes, demanding that they pay up right now. They empty up their bank accounts to the Church of Scientology, or they're going to get declared suppressive, and they're going to, get raked, and they're getting raked over the coals hardcore for this. They didn't really do anything to deserve this treatment, right? They were successfully doing exactly what L. Ron Hubbard said for them to do. And their reward was, getting publicly pilloried. And many of them, just got declared suppressive. And they were kicked out of the church altogether. And this was a real bloodbath. And this is kind of a famous time period in Scientology, just this. It was called the mission holder shakeup, and or meltdown, however you want to call it, or Holocaust. And they just like cleaned the slate, and they converted a lot of these missions into official churches of Scientology. This is where a lot of the churches that exist now, this is where they came from. Santa Barbara, where I first got started, had been one of these very successful missions that the church basically just took over and grabbed up and kicked the mission holders out of the picture and said, you better be grateful for what we gave you, for the crumbs we're leaving you with, and that's kind of the whole attitude. That's how it went down. And Miscavige led the charge on that at Hubbard's orders. But, how much of those orders were based on false information and Hubbard and Miscavige and Broker stoking Hubbard's paranoia,
That sounds sad, like a bunch of people trying to act in good faith, giving service, trying to build the kingdom, so to speak, only to have everything kind of ripped away and to be shamed and demoted.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And at this point, then, Gail Irwin, who had taken over for Dee Dee earlier, right? She'd been busted. Now Gail took over. Now she gets busted. And she takes the fall for false reports, gets busted off post by Miscavige. And also, this other guy named Bill Franks, who had been the nominal ecclesiastical head, he'd been the public head of Scientology. He'd been holding a position called the Executive Director International. And he'd been running around and he'd been working with Miscavige and everybody else trying to get Scientology settled and get things the way Hubbard wanted them. And he gets locked up and taken off the lines, right? And DM is now basically running everything. And he's got this whole corporate sort out that he's got going, and he's got the all clear thing that he's got going, and he's running ASI as the chairman of the board. And he starts putting people in charge that he is now basically personally handpicking. And this is, I'm trying to avoid getting into lots and lots of names because I don't want to be super, super confusing. And there's a lot of moving parts already that we're talking about here. But so there's these public level shakeup. There's shakeups going on up above, and Miscavige is using all this confusion to rise higher and higher and be more and more in charge and more in control. That's really what's going on here. And he's using Scientology's internal ethics system and justice system to do this. All right. And they don't really care, by the way, at this time. This is very... this has been characterized by people who were around at the time who look back on it as sort of the takeover by the Young Turks. Like, this is the young guys, these people who had been working under Hubbard, like Miscavige and these other messengers, these other people who had been working under him for years. These were younger people. They were in their 20s, right? They'd been brought up on the boat under Hubbard, and these are the people that Miscavige is now systematically getting rid of. But he's also picking those who are loyal to him and putting them in power positions. So it's kind of, shaking out through 81 and 82 that he's the guy to be following. He's the guy that you want to be friends with if you want to, if you want things to go well for you.